Ernest Hemingway. The name alone is legend. To others, he was a deeply flawed macho-chauvinist, a narcissist, a brute hiding behind his own myth. To some, he was the embodiment of masculinity, hard-drinking, bullfighting, war-chasing writer who turned life into literature and pain into poetry. But the truth is more complicated and far more human. But on the inside, he was spiraling, wrestling with a brain that wouldn't let him rest, drowning in alcohol and rage, running from something he couldn't name, even as it tore him apart. He was a man caught in the violent crossfire of fame, family, illness, and identity. A man born into a house already burning, a man raised by a father battling bipolar disorder, and a mother who blurred the lines between nurture and control. Hemingway wasn't just a caricature of strength or scandal. From the outside, he lived a life of grand adventure war zones, safaris, Parisian, and Pulitzer Prizes. This isn't just the story of a famous writer who met a tragic end. It's the story of how we create legends to avoid facing the uncomfortable truths about mental illness, trauma, and masculinity. The myth of Hemingway is bold and romantic. The reality is far more heartbreaking and far more important, because behind the persona was a man, and that man was suffering. Ernest Hemingway didn't just walk into a storm, he was born into one. His family history reads like a case study in inherited trauma, a lineage shadowed by mental illness, dysfunction, and silence. His father, Clarence Hemingway, was a respected doctor, also a man crippled by undiagnosed bipolar disorder, rigid, abusive, prone to violent mood swings. He would later take his own life with the same kind of shotgun Ernest would one day use himself. Then there was his mother, Grace, a woman who projected conflicting expectations onto her son, praising masculine strength while forcing him, as a child, to wear dresses and perform as her twin daughter. Confusing, controlling, emotionally disorienting. This wasn't a childhood built on security or love. It was one built on contradiction and fear. By the time Hemingway was a teenager, he had already internalized a dangerous lesson. Emotions were weakness, vulnerability was shameful, and pain was best buried. But no matter how far he ran, the inheritance followed. Because this wasn't just environmental, it was in his blood, a genetic legacy of depression, bipolar disorder, and suicide that would echo for generations. 4 of the 6 Hemingway siblings would eventually die by their own hand. This wasn't a coincidence, it was a pattern, one that no one talked about until it was too late. Understanding Hemingway means understanding this inheritance. He didn't create the darkness, he was born into it. The real tragedy is that he had to fight it alone. By his early 20s, Ernest Hemingway was already scarred, but the damage was only beginning. In World War I, he volunteered as an ambulance driver, barely out of adolescence when a mortar shell tore through his body, shattering his knee, embedding over 200 pieces of shrapnel in his legs, and nearly killing him. He survived, but his brain had changed. That injury was the first of many. Concussions from car accidents, head trauma from plane crashes, 6 documented traumatic brain injuries over the course of his life, each one chipping away at his cognitive function, his mood stability, his grip on reality. And through it all he drank. Alcohol became a constant. It dulled the pain, numbed the rage, and temporarily quieted the noise inside his head. But it also rewired his brain, magnified his depression, and worsened his already unstable moods. At the time, no one understood the connection between traumatic brain injuries and mental illness. No one linked the blackout rages, the paranoia, the cognitive decline to actual damage inside his skull. Instead, they called it temperament. They called it ego. They called it Hemingway being Hemingway. But behind closed doors, the cracks were widening. He couldn't write like he used to. He couldn't think like he used to. He was forgetting things, slurring his speech, losing control. The man who once bent language to his will was now struggling to form coherent sentences. His body was failing. His brain was deteriorating. And still, he was expected to perform to be the myth, not the man. This wasn't just a mental illness. This was a physical breakdown of neurons, nerves, and identity. And no one knew how to help him. Not back then. By the 1950s, Ernest Hemingway was no longer a larger-than-life icon. He was a man in retreat, physically, mentally, spiritually. The stories weren't flowing. The fame felt hollow. The pain was constant. He was paranoid. He believed the FBI was following him, that his phones were tapped. Doctors would later confirm it wasn't delusion. The FBI really was surveilling him, but that didn't make the fear any easier to live with. His body had become a prison. He was suffering from It left him exhausted, disoriented, and depressed, but it went undiagnosed until it was far too late. Meanwhile, his drinking worsened. His writing stalled. His memory faltered. Friends watched as he unraveled, helpless to stop it. Eventually, he checked into the Mayo Clinic not for rehab, not for rest, but for electroconvulsive therapy. Shock treatments, the primitive kind, violent, crude. They wiped out large parts of his memory, his words, his stories, his self. When he returned home, he was a shell. He told a friend, "It's terrible. After the ECTS, I can't write anymore. What is a writer without his memory? What indeed? That's when the suicide attempts began. First in silence, then in desperation. He had become a ghost in his own life, haunted by everything he could no longer express. And then, on July 2nd, 1961, in the early hours of the morning, Ernest Hemingway picked up his shotgun, the same model his father had used, and he ended it, not suddenly, not impulsively, but after a lifetime of trying to outrun a darkness that had always been catching up. This was not weakness, it was exhaustion. Ernest Hemingway died at 61. But in truth, he'd been dying for years, bit by bit, blow by blow. And yet, we still tell his story through myths. The macho icon, the womanizer, the drunk genius. We reduce him to roles that are easier to understand than the reality they conceal. But the real story, the one we don't often tell, is about how our culture fails men in pain. How we teach them to hide it, to drink through it, to fight it alone, until there's nothing left to fight with. Hemingway wasn't just a victim of his own demons. He was a casualty of a world that didn't understand mental illness, that didn't treat brain injuries, that mocked vulnerability, that punished sensitivity. He was born into genetic fire, raised in emotional chaos, and celebrated for pretending it didn't hurt. And for a while, he pulled it off. But the cost was devastating. What if we looked beyond the myth? What if we saw Hemingway not as a legend or a cautionary tale, but as a human being hurting, brilliant, flawed, afraid? What if we asked, how many Hemingways are still out there suffering silently, drowning in expectations, hiding behind performance? This story isn't just about Ernest, it's about us. It's about what we choose to see and what we choose to ignore. Because behind every legend is a life, and sometimes that life is asking for help in the only way it knows how. Ernest Hemingway's life wasn't just a cautionary tale. It was a mirror reflecting what happens when brilliance meets silence, when suffering is masked by performance, and when a society rewards strength but punishes struggle. He gave us unforgettable characters. He reshaped modern literature, and he lived a life more intense, more chaotic, and more tragic than fiction could ever contain. But the most important story Hemingway ever told might be the one we've been too afraid to hear. Mental illness doesn't care how successful you are. Trauma doesn't respect talent, and silence can be deadly. If this story resonated with you, if you or someone you love is living in that same silence, know this: you're not weak for feeling pain. You're not alone for being lost. And asking for help isn't surrender, it's survival. We remember Hemingway for his strength, but maybe we should remember him for his pain, too. Not to glorify it, but to learn from it, and to make sure that fewer stories have to end the way his did.